All right, so last week we actually started our journey into step 4. And last week we talked about King David and how King David had some issues. What are some highlights you guys had from last week that were here? What was something that you remember or stood out to you?
How he had someone killed.
Okay, all right.
So he could have someone else's wife.
Yep, okay. What's some other things? Anybody else have anything that you're just like, oh my goodness? Yep, Debbie?
How he repented for being sorry for what he did.
Yeah, he took inventory. He had God take inventory of his heart. So we are still sticking with this step 4, which is we made a searching and fearless moral inventory of ourselves. So today, if you picked up a bulletin, you'll see that today's topic is about the impact of family. And that is such a hot button or click button in the recovery community. Anytime you hear that phrase, the impact of family, people automatically think a certain way about it or think that it means X, Y, Z. So I'm going to come at this from a completely different angle. And so what I'm focusing on is this impact of family and how it relates to our recovery and also how it relates to the scriptures. So, starting out, my family loves soul food. Does anybody else in here love soul food? Like, we got one way in the back, way back there, okay. So, yeah. So, if you've ever had my baked mac and cheese, you would know just how much I love soul food and how serious I am about cooking soul food. Except my mom doesn't like mac and cheese, so she doesn't count. But but in my family though, seriously though, food was always at the center of everything. Cooking food was one way that we showed our love and how we also competed against each other. So like there's this thing like within black families, like not everybody can bring the sweet potatoes, or not everybody can bring the potato salad. That's just a no-no because you just don't know what people are going to put in that stuff. So it's a competition within our culture. When we're cooking food, it's like, look, mine's going to taste better than yours. Like I have this aunt who no one can touch her mac and cheese. And even though I try, I still will never make it to her level. And she knows it, and everybody knows it. But I try, though. I try to compete with her. Because soul food is a big deal. Food is a big deal. When we celebrate within my family, food is there. When we mourn the death of someone, food is there. When we just hung out together, food was always there. Overeating was normalized in my family. Binge eating was normalized in my family. No wonder I ended up having an overeating problem myself because food was always at the center of our lives. And not just the healthy food, but the traditional Southern soul food. With the greens and the ham hocks in it and the black eyed peas with maybe even the pig feet in there, all of that. Not the healthy stuff, right? And in addition to that food though, that traditional Southern soul food, most of my family were also heavy drinkers and gamblers. And some of them struggled with substances of some sort. I mean, if you've been around long enough, you would know, that my family is one of those rare families where there's quite a few of us that we've been healed and are walking in our recovery, which is a very rare thing. Like my mother is walking in her recovery and has 6 years, and I have 11 years, and my dad has 6 years. And that's a very rare thing to see a family reconciled in that kind of way from substances and alcohol. And so most of my family are still in that stuck place. Now let me be clear. I'm not blaming my family for my struggle with overeating, for my struggles with pills, for my struggles with alcohol. I'm not blaming them for that. So let me be very clear. But what I am doing is that I'm looking at how they influenced my development. How they influenced it. Because our families, they do play a role in how we develop and the habits that we learn. And sometimes we accidentally pay the price for their sins or for their mistakes, as some people like to say. In the Old Testament, in the book of Nehemiah, there's this wonderful story of the children of Israel, and they did this deep soul searching. It was like they took their own step forward. They made a searching and fearless moral inventory of themselves. So in Nehemiah, in chapter 9, what ends up happening is when the Jewish nation returned from exile, they confessed their sins. But here's the kicker. As you read on in the chapter, as they confess their sins, they not only confess their sins, but they confess the sins of their ancestors who were already dead. You see, they blame their ancestors, and in their case, rightfully so, for their captivity and the difficult situations that they were facing. Now, in this chapter, they recant all the things that God did for their ancestors when he brought them out of Egypt. They remembered all of the miracles that God did. They remembered every promise that God fulfilled to them, to their ancestors. And they confessed that at every opportunity, those same ancestors chose to turn their back on God and chose to embrace sin and chose to willfully put themselves back into captivity. They really took some moral inventory. Now here's what they said. This is Nehemiah 9:34 through 38. I'm reading the CSB version. They said, "Our kings, our leaders, priests, and ancestors did not obey your law or listen to your commands and warnings you gave them. When they were in their kingdom, with your abundant goodness that you gave them, and in the spacious and fertile land that you set before them, they would not serve you or turn from their wicked ways. Here we are today, slaves in the land you gave our ancestors, so that they could enjoy its fruit and its goodness. Here we are, slaves in it. Its abundant harvest goes to the kings you have set over us because of our sins. They rule over our bodies and our livestock as they please. We are in great distress. Heavy stuff. They came to God and they admitted the truth. He had been faithful and they had not been. He had been faithful and their ancestors had not been. Now, after reading that, I was just like, oh. Because it was like at that moment, I could clearly see how addictions can carry long-term impacts on our ancestors. The impact on our children and our grandchildren on down the line can be devastating. Unhealthy habits are formed, and not even just substance related, but just unhealthy habits in the way that we deal with life, the way that we interact with people. Oftentimes when we're in our addictions, we never learned, if we started young, we never learned social interaction. So then here we are at like maybe 25 years old, and we don't know how to interact with people on the most basic level because we never had that chance and we're never taught how because of the spot that we were in, because of the brokenness. So that's why it's often hard for people when we're in recovery and when we're getting recovery when we're older, because we have to go back and relearn those. We have to retrain our mind, and not just for the substance related, but just in life in general. We have to go back and redo everything, and we have to relearn everything. And so Israel realized that was the spot that they were in. They saw what their ancestors had done and saw where that led them. And they saw the missed opportunities that they had because of the mistakes of their ancestors. And so that struck me, because oftentimes in my family, pain is ignored. How many men in here were raised to believe that men aren't allowed to cry? How many men in here bottled up their emotions because of that? You're not even a man. But that's generational. That's generational, right? Real men don't cry. Suck it up. Deal with it. You know? push through.
Sign of weakness.
Phrases, yeah, sign of weakness. They're taught that, right? That's generational. And just like in our addictions, those habits and those teachings, what we show our children is passed down as acceptable. What they see us do and say becomes acceptable. Step 4 agrees with what God did throughout the centuries. He calls us to make a searching and fearless moral inventory of ourselves. Let's take a look at 2 Corinthians 13:5. Here's what it says. Today I don't have any slides for you because my sermon is so short. I'm like, you guys can get this. I'm just looking at a couple verses. So 2 Corinthians 13:5. Test yourselves to see if you are in the faith. Examine yourselves. Or do you yourselves not recognize that Jesus Christ is in you? So today, I want to encourage you to take inventory on the habits, the traditions, the teachings that have been passed down to you through your family. Examine those things and see if they line up with Scripture. Now, sure, some traditions and habits and things like that aren't harmful and they're fun, and things like that. So I'm not talking about that, but really examine the attitudes and the outlook on life and the way that we approach problems, or maybe even look at finances. Maybe, look clear across the board. What habits in your life, what teachings in your life have been passed down to you that are now a stumbling block? What in your life have you been taught that's holding you up from growing, that's stopping you from growing? Because that's where Israel was. They had reached a wall and they couldn't go any farther. I mean, they were literally slaves. That get any worse than that. And in the same way, when we're in our addictions, stuck in active addictions, we are slaves. And sometimes when we get out of the stage of using or out of the stage of drinking, we're then slaves to our emotions.
Yes.
So we're just reacting on them. We're slaves to our minds. We don't take our mental health serious. Why don't we get mental health days? Side note, when you have a job, they give you physical health days, right? They give you sick days, right? That's common, right? They're like, oh, you got a cold? Okay, you got a sick day. How about you take that? What about a mental health day? Maybe there's just some days that I don't want to be around people. Maybe there's just some days I need to sit in a quiet room and talk to God because of how I feel. Why is that not acceptable? Yeah, hey, we got an amen in the back. I see an amen. Like, why is that not acceptable? I'll tell you why it's not acceptable. Because people like to ignore problems. That's why it's not acceptable. Our culture, and this isn't even just racial culture, but our culture in general, we see that it has ignored mental health. It has ignored mental health. And that's why we have so many who are struggling with SUD or AUD, substance use disorder, or alcohol use disorder. They're in there and they have those things, but they have co-occurring disorders. And people try to treat that like it's a separate thing when it's an anomaly, and it's not.
Yeah.
More of us have co-occurring disorders than more of us. There's many of us who don't just have SUD or AUD. Many of us have mental health that goes right along with it, and yet it's ignored. And so when I read this about Israel and I thought about that, that's something else that was ignored in my family, that was passed down throughout the generations. We don't talk about that.
Yes.
We don't talk about the uncles or the cousins who are predators. We don't talk about that.
Yes.
And that's passed down throughout the generations. We don't speak out against that. Instead, we tell our children to watch what they wear instead of calling out the pedophiles in our family. We blame our children instead of blaming the pedophiles. That's generational. That's passed down. We ignore our mental health and we say, oh, it's fine. Everybody has problems. It's passed down in my family. So many people in my family have bipolar, and yet none of them will go and actually get a diagnosis, but we all know they do. And they're They won't address it, and they're in danger, and they put those around them in danger. And so when I read this about the Israel and how their troubles and their problems, they could see how a lot of those things were passed down. It gripped my heart, because I was like, man, that's my family. That's me. That's where I am. And so I did that searching and took that inventory on that. I took that, And there's several times in my life when I've reached a moment where I had a moment of clarity, and I was able to take that inventory in the past. Like there was one time, my little sister right there, when she was probably around 12 or so, she walked up to me and she said something that I had said. And then she said, and I was shocked, and I was like, I didn't even know you heard me say that. And she's like, well, I'm always watching you, sissy. I want to be like you. And it sounds so cliche, but there's always somebody watching us. There's always somebody watching us that wants to be like us. If we don't have kids, and maybe it's not kids, maybe it's nieces, maybe it's nephews, maybe it's friends, maybe it's cousins. But they're grandchildren. There's always someone there watching us that's like, I want to be like you. So take that inventory and see what traditions you are going to choose to pass down. And if there are some that you need to let go of, then let go of those so that you can open your hands to put in new ones, so that you can put in healthy ones, so that you can put in ones that are going to build them up, give them a shot at a good future, give them a chance. Yes. Yes. So examine the impact of family. When we talk about examination, as you can see, we have communion set up here. So as we talk about examination and teaching on the proper observance of the Lord's Supper or communion, the Apostle Paul wrote a few words about it. He wrote a few words about self-examination, self-reflection, because communion was designed to be that moment. When we take communion as Christians, that was designed not just to be that moment where we, as in Jesus said, to do in remembrance of him, but it was designed to be a time of self-examination. Here's what he said in 1 Corinthians chapter 11, verses 27 through 31. So then, whoever eats the bread or drinks the cup of the Lord in an unworthy manner will be guilty of sin against the body and blood of the Lord. Let a person examine himself in this way. Let him eat the bread and drink from the cup. For whoever eats and drinks without recognizing the body eats and drinks judgment on himself. This is why many are sick and ill among you, and many have fallen asleep. If we were properly judging ourselves, we would not be judged. So Paul warns against taking communion without taking a fearless and moral inventory of our heart. He gives us that warning. And as I mentioned, Jesus told us that when we take communion, we do it in remembrance of what he did for us. So when we actually stop and think what he did for us, that his body was tortured and broken, we would find ourselves in a place of repentance automatically if we actually took a moment and thought about that. Because we're not deserving of his sacrifice, but he did it anyway. So, on the night of Jesus' betrayal, he took the bread and he broke it, and he said, "This is my body, which is broken for you." In the same way, he took the cup and he blessed it, and he said, "This is my blood, which is poured out for you. Do this in remembrance